I'll just share a little bit about him. He is a Faithkeeper on the Onondaga Council of Chiefs of the Haudenosaunee Nation. He was also one of the original members of the traditional circle of Indian elders, which actually started right here in the great state of Montana. He was an academic All-American lacrosse player at Syracuse University. And in the Indigenous tradition of giving and generosity, after he had kind of agreed to do this, he actually sent me, see if we can see it right. Oh, that's not going to work. He sent me, it's called Spirit Game, The Pride of a Nation. And it's about the history of the sport of lacrosse and about the reclamation by the Iroquois Nation of this sport that culminated in them hosting the Nationals in 2015. And it's got some pretty big name people in it. It has Jim Brown and also Bill Belichick, and obviously features Oren Lyons. And so if there's any PE teachers out there, and you want to do a unit on lacrosse and use this as a way to supplement it, I think that's a great idea. And you can get this on Amazon. So I did want to thank Oren again for sharing that and encourage folks to check that out. Couple more things about Oren. He's been a lifelong advocate for Indigenous rights and social justice. And he's also, we have today someone who has also addressed the United Nations, addressing you today. So I think that's pretty special. And I've had the opportunity to visit with him now over the last month or so as we've been talking about this, and he's been very gracious about sharing his knowledge, his wisdom, his perspective. And I guess two of my big takeaways, that one has been this idea that, I believe the way he's phrased it is, when the colonists got here, everywhere they looked, they saw independence. And so this idea that, the notion of American independence came from the colonists who were coming from a monarchy, viewing Indigenous people and seeing independence. And I think that's pretty insightful. And also he has a quote about treaties. And I know he's going to talk about the Treaty of 1775 today, but he is, I've seen a video with him where he described it as shaking hands and looking at the future together is what that process is. So I thought that was pretty profound as well. So at any rate, the last thing I want to say is that as a first generation college graduate from the Kootenai or Kasonka homelands in Montana, who 21 years ago was a first-year teacher in Fort Belknap, where the Ani and Dakota tribes live today, to today being able to introduce one of America's renowned Indigenous elders and a member of the Haudenosaunee, Mr. Oren Lyons. Take it away, Oren.
That's our greeting, which standard greeting with the Haudenosaunee. And it simply means thank you for being well. And the response is Gwashadogus, which means what you say is true. So Nyohaskano, thank you for being here, being well. And thank you for the invitation to address your very important collection of leaders and teachers and the issues that need to be addressed, I believe, in the arena of education. The history of the Indigenous people here, for whatever reason, has not been told. And as I have observed, as well as you, the Black Lives Matter, the issues of of slavery and Black people, long suppressed and never really addressed until these times. It's an amazing history. Prior to that particular history of slavery here, prior to that, there was, and is this continent that we call Turtle Island. And on this Turtle Island, there were millions of peoples, nations, civilizations, ways of life that were completely unknown to the European brothers and sisters. They just didn't know that the continents existed here. They didn't know there was a North, Central, and South hemisphere, a Western hemisphere. And when Columbus made his landfall, he thought he was in India. And so the first misnomer was he addressed the people as Indians. So when we travel and speak with our brothers and sisters from India, they say, we're the Indians. And we say, we know that. And we agree with you. But we didn't name ourselves. This was done by a man called Columbus. So it started out with a mistake. And then Turtle Island, which is our name for this northern continent, it was named America. And that was after an Italian, Amerigo Vespucci. So we start out historically with, I would say, misleading understandings of first of all, who we are and where this place is. Turtle Island. That's the original name that we have given this great land. And our people, in particular, Haudenosaunee, I'm going to kind of stay in that arena as we go forward, because I know more about ourselves, of course, than many of the other Native nations, Indian nations in this country. The count continues to expand as the United States government recognizes, and I use that word in quotes, the existence of nations and kind of extends a tap on their head to give them a reality. And so the count is somewhere around 572 Indian nations in this country, with their own people, their own languages, their own cultures. And that is way down from how many were here originally at the landfall of Columbus. There's a great history of genocide here that has never been addressed. So that's would be my favorite first request to you leaders and teachers, is that you address the genocide of the indigenous people of this continent, both here, North, Central, and South America, the hemisphere, and acknowledge the existence of many millions of peoples and their civilizations and nations. And so as teachers, and as myself becoming a teacher, in the history of my own history, I should very quickly tell you that I quit school in the 7th grade, but that was way back in 1937. Now, 1930s, in those times, very few of our people went on to higher education. I mean, we went through the standard first grade, second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth grade. But about sixth grade, most everybody would just quit and go to work and whatever we were doing. But basically, we were a lot of structural construction workers, so forth. And so we didn't pay much attention to higher every once in a while, one of our people would go through. And I think that's pretty much across the country. But in 1937, you just try to go back to that time, and it was a period in the 30s, 1930, so forth, when you had very bad problems in the United States itself. We were in a major depression. And our nation, I was brought up, at Onondaga, and as a young person, I had a great life. I thought I was very happy with my life. We had close friends. It was a wide open community, and it was a real community. We would run up and down the nation, roads and territories and lands and homes in different places, and we were always welcome. We were always patted on the head, and first question they would say to us, was, "Oh, who's your mother and who's your father?" And then establish who we were. And whenever there was time to eat, no matter where you were, you just automatically sat right down there and shared whatever there was. So it was a great community. And I didn't know we were poor. I don't know, as far as I was concerned, that's just the way things were. And at that time, we didn't go to the store only just maybe once a month, perhaps, to get staples. And I went with my mother. I would be pulling a wagon, maybe 6 or 7 years old, and we would walk to the store, which was 2.5 miles away, and buy bulk material, bags of flour and chunks of salt pork and things of that nature, bags of sugar. We didn't buy what you see today in any of the stores. It was very different. And did our own cooking, did our own planting, took care of ourselves. And lived, with a shotgun and a rifle, and we hunted and fished and gathered out there in the woods what could be eaten. It was just a standard way of life. And we had a group, all of our kids, as it goes in any community, they run around in age groups. And I grew up with an age group. We still, now at the age of 91, I'm just one or two of the last of our age group left, but we stuck together all through life, which is, I think, a general way of people living. Anyway, it was a good life. I thought it was very happy, and the Longhouse was the community center, and there was always something going on there. And there was either, dances or ceremonies, and ceremonies was always meant a lot of food. Food was always part of everything, and weddings and funerals and big meetings when people would be coming from governments at times and be meeting at the Longhouse, and then maybe the chiefs of all the 6 nations would be gathering at the. So it was a real center of activity, and still is. I mean, and I would say that that was the central arena for my life, and as growing up as a young lad, that was the center of activity. There was always something happening there, and very, very much a social center too, as well, dances. And so, so it was the most important center in my young life. And at the age of 91, it is still the most important center of my life. And so it was a happy time for me, even though I come to understand later on that we were poor. But by the standards that we had in the nation itself, we were very, very well off with all the communities and all the friends and aunts and uncles, and everybody was always looking out for us. And there was always some kind of food cooking somewhere, and we shared everything. Everything was shared. So that was a good life, I thought. I was very fortunate, I think, today to have that life where, as young boys, we'd be out in the woods and we knew what to pick, we knew what to eat, we knew what to find stuff to eat. And, we would catch crabs and cook them up and, took care of ourselves. We didn't need to come back for lunch. And then in the evening, the mothers would stand on the porch and they would holler for us to come home. And everybody knew the mothers holler. You could hear, I mean, they had good voices. They would reach out a mile away, you hear your mother calling you home. And then they would say, oh, that's your mother. And they would immediately go home. So that was the kind of a life we had. And I was fortunate, I believe, to experience that. Things are different these days. The television is taken over and people don't go outside anymore. We don't, not in the woods. We never walk on the road. We're always in the woods. All the paths along the creeks were beaten down. Everybody was down by the water, down by the creeks, up in the woods. We never stayed home. We couldn't wait to get out and go. So it was a good life. And there was always the leaders. There was all the grandmas and their grandpas, everybody. So it was a fortunate time for me. And I just passed that on to give you some kind of a picture of where we grew up. And that, of course, that's time advanced, and electricity came to Onondaga finally in 1947, I believe. Prior to that, it was lamplight, kerosene lamps, and so forth. I remember all that. And being born in 1930, I experienced the changes and so forth. And today is so different from those times, and issues that we never would have thought about are here today. So we all face this, and your grandmothers and your grandfathers know what I'm talking about because they went through the same thing. And prior to that, the histories of our nations and our people, the sovereignty issues, the issues of who we are always at the forefront. And so as we come forward, in preparation for this discussion, I began writing. My duties as Faithkeeper of the Turtle Clan of the Onondaga Council of Chiefs, has broadened out to be a speaker sort of for the house itself. Because I went to university, because I had a college education, and that's a whole story in itself. You go from 7th grade to university. It's quite a transition. But fortunately, I managed to do that with a lot of good luck, and in the interim, good teachers, good people that you all have, and you all remember. And it's important to remember those people, and to remember, and also to look at them as a resources to answer questions that you may have today. and you who are in my age group or the elder age group have become a resource, and people will come to you for advice. And, experience is a good teacher. And, they always talk about the wisdom of the elders, but I know a lot of dumb people who are old. They're old, cantankerous, they wouldn't change for nothing. So it just depends how you go about it. And so I was asked to become a member of the Council of Chiefs by my clan mother. I accepted that duty. And I won't go into the history of all that, except to say that it became a huge learning process for me, because now I was not thinking myself, I had to think about the nation and the people. And when I was asked to be on the Council of Chiefs, I had already graduated from the Syracuse University, class of 59. And I was in New York City, expanding my wings as a commercial artist. I am an artist, and a pretty good one in terms of that. And I was making my way in the white man's world, so to speak. And when I was now going into my 10th year in New York City in the 60s. And I was called home. I came back to Onondaga in 1970. And they asked me to continue my education so that we could build a cultural center. And in that process, I got another degree, and then young Indians from the Haudenosaunee, who were now students at the University of Buffalo, came to me and said, "You have the qualification to be a professor. We need a leader here. We need our own system. Will you come and do that?" And I was very reluctant to do that, but after a lot of pressure, I did go. And I took on the development of the Native American Studies program at the University of Buffalo, SUNY Buffalo, State University of New York at Buffalo. And I became a professor. And I retired in 2008. So that was 36 years of work there. That was going to be temporary. But it was a good place to be, because then I could be effective in what is being taught, and also learning where to look and developing my own book list and so forth. Anyway, all of this taking place while great events were happening throughout the country. And the Haudenosaunee has always been leaders in the Indian world. And we went to Geneva in 1977, which was a watershed year. And in that trip to Geneva, we brought the issues of Indigenous people. And just to illustrate to you the effects that we've had on that history, the terminology of the term Indigenous people is one that we sponsored and used. Because as we were preparing meetings held in the Lakota nations and nations around the country, preparing to go to Geneva to take our issues outside the grip of the United States, we learned that the alliances that were there, and we also, had hopes, I guess, beyond the realities. We thought, well, if we can get to the United Nations in Geneva and bring our issues there, that we'll finally, settle some of this. Well, of course, when we finally did get to Geneva in 1977, and this Six Nations was asked to lead that group, they said, you have the longest history of dealing with our brothers from across the water. So we'll ask you, would you take the leadership? And our leaders said at the time, yes, we'll accept that responsibility. We'll do the best we can. We don't, we're not sure how it all turned out, but we'll do it. And we accepted that. And we developed a group that went to Geneva in 1977. And probably around maybe close to 200 delegates from North, Central, and South America to present our case of human rights and treaties. And the issue was treaties, agreements made that were not being attended. And so I've taken one of those treaties as the discussion point for your education today, so that you have some idea of the history. What I found out, or what I was always wondering, was how come I don't know this, because I went to, in the first, second, third, fourth, fifth grade, sixth grade at Onondaga Nation. We had a school there, but it was a contest all the time. I know we were always battling the will of the teachers and ourselves. It would be a battle of wills every day we went to school. And our parents would just take us to the gate and leave us there, and we would go to the school. So it was a foreign entity actually right in the center of our territory. And so we were educated up to that point, and most of us just couldn't wait to quit and go to work. Most of our men were structural workers, or very famous iron workers. They put up buildings all over the world, and dangerous work, but stuff that our men were able to do and would do. And so we just took it for granted that's what we were going to do. But as it turned out, I became a teacher. So I went, from a uneducated kid who quit school in the seventh grade to college. I graduated with some honors at Syracuse University, and very, very grateful for that, opening up the doors to other events. And I became part of the Council of Chiefs, and that was a whole nother huge arena. And then I continued my work as a professor, as I mentioned, and it was a good coalition altogether, and returning home and working at the nation. And that work for the nation carried me around the world. I've been to most countries on behalf of our confederation and all indigenous peoples. Two countries I have not been to, and one is China and the other is India. But we had meetings in the Soviet Union, where was the Soviet Union. We had meetings in South America, into Colombia. We had meetings, in Paris. So we had a broad spectrum of activities. And the Council of Chiefs of Onondaga is, first of all, you're the center of the politics and the nation's welfare. So your first duty is to your nation. You do your work there, and then the Six Nation Confederacy, which is the broader our confederation, which is very old, probably 1,600 years old, based on peace, and then the responsibility of indigenous people in North America, and then indigenous people around the world. It just never ends. And far as I'm concerned, you never stop learning. And so it's important for you now as teachers to understand that your own history. What I've learned over a period of time is that the Native people have been deliberately erased from history. The 19th century, the 20th century had been the 19th century was a terrible century for Native people. There was annihilation, there was murders, there was killings, there was the slaughter of the buffalo. You know, what happened to 60 million buffaloes? They were eradicated. They were killed trying to bring the Plains Native nations into some kind of control. They killed all the buffalo as a military tactic, and went down to a handful of buffaloes in the Bronx Zoo. Can you imagine? All, you know, a part of history that I'm pretty sure you don't know or think about. And what happened to the passenger pigeons? You know, there were so billions of them. You know, they fly by, and our people, you know, it was a food source, but they never, you know, they never killed the mating pair. They always took the young. Even there were so many, but they were still preserving the mating pair. That was our system. Always be careful about nature and how it works, operates, work with it. Yeah, what happened? You know, there's a passenger pigeon in the Museum of Rochester in New York, and they said it's the last one, and it died in 1914. So how do you account for that? Who accounts for that? Who's responsible for that slaughter, and for the slaughter of the buffaloes, and for the slaughter of Native people? You know, you have a history, and it's not a good one. But you have to address that. You have to address that, because as we go forward and looking to the health and welfare of our children and the generations coming, we have to change what we've been doing and really, literally make a hard turn for the common good. We have to challenge the whole idea of capitalism, which is powerful. And in spite of, you know, all of our knowledge and so forth, in today's times when we're supposed to be preparing to defend ourselves against this pandemic and global warming and so forth, business as usual goes on. Corporations go on to make their money. They're not preserving, they're not anything. And so when thinking about the future of your children, you have to change that. And one way to change that, understand, you know, history. And so I ask you to concentrate on this 1775 treaty. And this 1775 treaty is a watershed treaty. This is when you were rebellion and rebels going to become a nation. And Benjamin Franklin, which I would consider to be your founding father as opposed to George Washington. George Washington was a soldier, and he was a, you know, obviously very capable person, but Ben Franklin had the vision. He saw things. He was, I understand he spoke Mohawk, but I'm not sure how you verify that. And but he was a student of our Confederacy, that was for certain. And when they were preparing to become an independent nation, he said, he had a good sense of wit and humor. He said, well, I can tell you now that in this endeavor we have to hang together or we'll all hang separately. And as it turned out, you have a nation. And in that nation are the treaties. And in those treaties, I would say the seminal treaty that ensured your future was this 1775 Treaty of Neutrality. in 1983 when President Reagan was reintroducing the draft. Our young men were getting draft notices, and they bring them to the council and say, "What is this? What is this?" And so we said, "Well, don't ignore it. Tell everybody, bring their notices here." And everybody was, using a Nedro, New York address to receive mail, the post office in Nedro. And of course, people who were recruiting had no idea that we were Native people or anything. So finally, the Selective Service, the federal government asked for a meeting. They said, "We know your position is not new. So can we have a meeting?" So 1983, at the Onondaga Longhouse, the United States government and the Selective Service all showed up, the black limousines and suits and so forth. And we called the meeting on Mother's Day in May 1983. And so when they all settled in the longhouse and we were prepared, we had our treaty belts, we had everything laid out. And we had speakers for each one. They made the first notation they made was a complaint. They said, you called this meeting on Mother's Day. And I was the speaker at that time. And I said to them, "Well, yes, but as far as we're concerned, every day is Mother's Day." And so it began with that kind of a discourse. But by the time we got to the War of 1812, in the historical context with our treaty belts and the histories, each one of our speakers was assigned to, they said, okay, it was getting late in the day and it was getting warm. And they said, "We asked you a question, then you answered it. And so we will not recruit your men." And I reminded them, I said, "Well, that's a treaty. It's not an option. That's a treaty, an agreement you made." 1983. So that goes back to this agreement in 1775, where that treaty was made in neutrality. And that's why I have chosen this particular one to tell you. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to send this treaty here, and there's many pages. It's almost 2 weeks of discussion, preparation, and so forth, all here. And this is your documentation. This is your record that you should be familiar with. And in here, in this treaty, you tell us that in our meeting at Lancaster, Pennsylvania in 1744, we advised you at that time, one of our Onondaga chiefs, Kanasatego, said to you at that time, "Look, you people never going to amount to anything. You're always fighting one another. Why don't you make a union like ours? And look how strong we are." And he went on to make this statement. And so 1775, the speakers, and you had the Continental Congress was there in Albany. It was so important for you, this meeting. And they said in 1744 in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, at the treaty meeting there, "You advised us to make a union like yours. We are now going to take your advice. We're going to plant a tree of peace. We're going to kindle the fire." And they used all of our symbols. And they said, "And we want you to sit with us as in peace." This is all in your records, and you should be familiar with it. And I remind you that this is only one treaty of many, of 300 some odd years of treaty making. This is the 1775 one, but I think it's the seminal one that you should have. And I'm going to make it available to you. so that you yourself can see that our leaders were speaking the same English language as you and had really, really clear, good speaking language. You'll be amazed at the discourse on how deliberate and how well run it was. But that was the system that we introduced. And the use of wampum is continually, you will see, used here in the process. So begins your education. And as educators, you should have this background. And in the Continental Congress, I would say this was a seminal treaty that allowed you to become the nation that you are today. Now you face similar problems, and in the future, your children are going to be facing these problems, but you have to avail yourself of the reality and the real truth of the history of this country and the genocide that was visited upon our people. It's so important for you to know the real history. And as I see, I'm not certain as to how much time I have left here. And I've moved away from my written discourse, but I will finish that. And I will also include it coming over to you so that you have something in your hand. But I urge you to study this treaty and study it closely and understand. It will give you so much of an understanding of how you became this great nation that you are and how perilous it is to maintain that integrity, as you can see today. There are problems here that are profound, but they've been brewing for a long time. I would just remind you that the founding fathers who said they wanted to make a union like ours, and we said, well, if you want to make a union like ours, where are the women? Because our system here is a matrilineal system. Our children follow the mother's side, not the men's side. And the clan mother, who is in charge of each of big families, they choose the leaders of their families. That you call a chief, you call Huyane, the good minds. They choose the leaders and they oversee the leaders' conduct. And they have the power, the authority, and the responsibility to remove that leader from that title that they hold for misconduct, malfeasance of office, or whatever. They don't tell you what to do. They don't tell you what to say. They oversee your conduct and your carrying of your duties. That's a balance of power, huge balance of power. That is, and I see, you aspired to that, but when you started out in 1775, there were no women in your leadership, and you had slavery. Your founding fathers owned slaves. Well, live and learn. And let's see, I would say the experiment of democracy is not over. It's still an experiment. And I go back to the words of John Mohawk, one of our resident, what I call the resident intellect of Iroquois. The man was just simply brilliant, a young man. He was one of the people that came and asked me to be a teacher at the University of Buffalo. And John was just one of those extraordinary people that all of our nations have. And he made an observation one time as we were having this kind of a discussion in a small group. And he said, well, as far as I can see, the human species is still a biological experiment. Let that sit in your mind. the human species is still a biological experiment. And now as we face these pandemics and an existential threat is out there now of our existence as a population, as a species, right now. How do we address that? Well, first of all, you're certainly going to have to change values. Now I'll go one more statement. In the process of governance and people trying to meet issues, I was invited to join a group called the Global Forum of Spiritual and Parliamentary Leaders for Human Survival. And people like the Dalai Lama and Mother Teresa and Gorbachev, President Gorbachev, they were all part of that. One of your vice president was there. And I asked Thomas Banyaka, the Hopi elder and leader, to accompany me. And we went to the meeting in London and we became part of the discussion. So at the meeting in at that time, the Soviet Union, we were moving towards a conclusion. So in 1991, the meeting was now held in Tokyo, and we had a lot of probably over 250 delegates from around the world, including, many prominent leaders that you know. And I asked Akio Matsumura, who was the executive director, I said, Akio, can we come to a conclusion? Let's get, here we are, let's have a conclusion. He said, okay, I'll present it. So he did. He said, can we reach a conclusion? Can we come to some kind of a statement? And we did. And at the end of that meeting, which was almost a week, the statement was 4 words. For all those years of meetings and so forth, 4 words. And they were value change for survival. Value change for survival. What they were saying was, if we, the human species, don't change our values, we will not survive. That's 1991. But here we are. Here we are looking at the existential threat of extinction as a species. So we have to change the values that have been driving us up to this point and failed and brought us to this position. That's a big mouthful for you. And a lot to absorb. But I think if you study the 1775 treaties, the principles that we talk about are ingrained there. And the principles of your leaders are also there. And with that, I'll close my discussion.
All right. Well, thank you again for being here today, Mr. Lyons, and for sharing your perspective. And I'm just reminded of, some of our essential understandings. We have, hundreds, if not thousands of years of oral history here. And we have essential understanding 6, which is different perspectives on history. So I thank you for sharing those. So we have a few minutes for questions. So if you have 1 or 2 in the chat, that is fine. But I would just ask you, what is it, you've talked about studying the treaty, but what would be sort of your single biggest piece of advice for teachers who are trying to share the Indigenous perspective with their students?
Well, the treaties are very clear and explicit, because as you read it through, you'll see how carefully they move point by point. And the transference then that they're talking about is the transference of the values that were driving the political.
Somebody mute him. Somebody mute him. Oh no, what happened? Jennifer,
Why don't you say he's muted? You're not muted, Zach, so just let him know.
Oren, I think you're muted. You might need to unmute. Can we- Nope.
Just touch it.
There you go. Okay, we can hear you now.
Oh, all right, all right. Well, I was just saying that the value change for survival that this group of leaders, world leaders, came to in 1991 in Japan. 4 words: value change for survival. If we don't change our values, we will not survive. So that's where we are. And that's a huge, dynamic change for America, which has put its values in commerce, almost totally in commerce. And now you need a moral structure. You're lacking the moral structure in your values. And that's what we said to you in 1775. The moral part is just fundamental to your values. And so you have to reach back and do that. And I would say, from my perspective, it's not too late, but it's pretty doggone close now. And we're in a pandemic, and there's going to be more. And then there is the global warming itself. We are in an existential crisis of climate. It's compounding. The ice is melting. The rivers are rising. The oceans are rising. We're depleting the fish. We're depleting everything. We have to change. That value change.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, we do it collectively too. I think it's focusing on our responsibilities as much, if not more, than our rights. So I think I would phrase it that way. But we do appreciate you being here today. If there's, we've got them for another couple of minutes. If there's any last questions, otherwise, thank you again. And we will. I did want to say, Mike and I are actually working on some lessons right now aligned to the new social studies standards around treaties. So we're very excited to be able to integrate the Treaty of 1775 into that. And just as a general thing, the new social studies standards really do emphasize use of primary source documents. So this is great.
Chad, there's questions coming up for you.
Okay, we've got some questions. Let's see.
So as a future middle school teacher, what do you think would have made you want to stay in school in 6th and 7th grade, Mr. Lyons?
Well, what made me stay in school, or I didn't go to school. Actually, I quit school because I felt the racism that was directed towards me by these teachers, and I just wasn't going to stand for that. And then I didn't agree with what they were saying. I just didn't agree. And so I was kind of a rebellious kid, and I didn't go back to school until after I had come back out of the Army. Then I tried to go back with a couple of my friends, and it was hit or miss. And finally, I was asked to go to Syracuse University. And at that time, because I was a lacrosse player, I was a pretty good goalkeeper. And
You should mention that
And so I agreed. I said, okay, I'll give it a shot. And went to Syracuse University. And one of the results was that Syracuse had the undefeated season in 1957. And one of my teammates was Jim Brown, the running back for the Cleveland Browns. So he was my face-off man. And Billy Brown, he played for Boston later on. And Jim Ridlon was a huge defenseman, fast and big and strong, and he played for the Dallas Cowboys. That was our team. And myself and Roy Simmons Jr., who later became the coach for Syracuse. And it was his father, Roy Simmons Sr., who was our coach. So, yeah, exceptional time, lucky.
All right, well, thank you, Oren. I'm just putting the link in here to Spirit Game, the Pride of a Nation. So anybody who's interested in reviewing it or purchasing it can do that. Were there any other questions that I may have missed in the chat? I don't think so. So thank you again for being here today. And we're very, very appreciative of all that you've shared. And you've given us a lot to think about. So,
Well, I won't go away. I'm here to help if you want to lean on me again sometime.
okay, well, appreciate that. And I'm sure we will be in touch, and we're excited to review the treaty and put something together that incorporates that into our curriculum. So
Thank you.
yeah. So we have the in the chat is the link to the Google Doc for the breakout sessions, and those will start in approximately 10 minutes. And so yeah, if you just want to make sure that you have the right link for the breakout that you're going to attend, you should be good, but we'll be here too to kind of shepherd anybody around who doesn't, for whatever reason, can't get into the right session.
I would like to say, if I may interject, that Mr. Lyons, you are getting much praise and much gratitude for your words of wisdom and for your sharing today. So I just want you to know that in the chat, you have a lot of appreciation coming your way.
Thank you. Oh, well.
All right.
Well, thank you, everybody. And now we will end this meeting for this session. And so go have a quick break, and we'll see you back in your breakout rooms. Look for the Google Doc with the links, and we'll be back here at 2:20.
Thank you. All right.